I don't know about you, but that's, to me, not a natural thing for wetlands to be doing. And you see the same kind of pattern in the summertime now. These wetlands are literally boiling with methane leakage as these systems warm up, act as a lens, and actually warm up the bottom sediments that are full of organic matter, and away we go with increasing methanes, which incidentally are about 21 to 23 times as heat trapping as carbon dioxide per molecule. We're also seeing, as the tundra warms, that it's more flammable because it dries out in the summertime. I was in Alaska in 2004 and overflew about a 4 million acre fire in Alaska tundra. And I talked to the Gwich'ins there, and they were very frustrated. They said, you know, we had this 4 million acre fire and we had to fight it pretty much alone. And the American people didn't even cover it on the news. We were outraged that our communities were being burnt out, and it was never even talked about in American news. Dangerous feedbacks are occurring also in the forest system, and we've seen some evidence of that. The University of Tel Aviv now suggests that through a study that they did, that lightning strikes increase by 10% for each degree rise in temperature. So as the temperature goes up, if the University of Tel Aviv study is accurate, we will see an increase in lightning. There's been a 4-fold increase in the number of fires in the U.S., a 6-fold increase in the number of acres burned. We have pretty good data here in the U.S. We've been tracking, ever since Smokey the Bear, we've been tracking forest fire records quite carefully. And in fact, forest fire fighting has now become the dominant budget item for the Forest Service. And we see a couple things happening. One, the big fires are increasing quite dramatically, and the number of acres that they consume are also increasing. Wildfires are sweeping landscapes. We've been watching in Southern California, particularly in this country, but also in Australia we've seen a real uptick in fires. And in fact, it wasn't talked about during the fires in Australia, but Melbourne had temperatures 117 degrees. They were setting record temperatures in Australia when these fires were burning. Mountain pine beetle is another threat to our forest system. As the systems warm up, these insects that once froze out over the winter are now surviving and doing tremendous damage. We now have twice the mortality in our forests in the West in the U.S. as we did even 20 or 30 years ago. So we've seen a real uptick in the mortality in our western forests, and that's spreading elsewhere as well. The circumpolar so-called boreal forests are also at great risk, and we're seeing some very strong signs there. The boreal forests in North America are burning much more today than they were in the past, again releasing carbon dioxide and also reducing the amount of carbon dioxide being stored by these forests. And in fact, the Canadians have been keeping track of their forests as a part of their Kyoto commitment, and they have seen 3 of the last 4 years for which records were kept that they're actually net producers of carbon dioxide, not net sequesters. And so this entire vast area of boreal forest in Canada, which is about 30% of the total boreal forest on the planet, is now giving off more carbon dioxide than it's storing. And they have projected their numbers forward over the next 10 years, and they believe that 9 of the next 10 years we're going to see the boreal forest of Canada giving off more carbon dioxide than they're actually storing. The Russians have not been spared either. Again, this doesn't make our newspapers, but an area the size of Pennsylvania burnt up in Russia boreal forest 2 years ago. And again, it didn't make any of the newspapers in this country because we don't care about Russian forests. But when you burn 28 million acres in a single season, that's a pretty serious problem. And the Sino-Russian fires are now 10 times historic levels. So we're seeing the same patterns, and I should say that they're having the same sort of disease problems that we're seeing in North America as well. The records are much sketchier in the Russian fires, though. Notice this is worldwide fires last year from January to September 2008, and this is tracked by NASA at the Goddard Space Flight Center. But you can see the number of fires on the planet and the dramatic impact that they are having. So in addition to beetle damage, we're seeing fires. British Columbia, for example, has lost 620 million cubic meters of wood, which is about 15 million logging trucks worth of wood. That's according to their Ministry of Forestry. So the Canadian forest, for which we get a lot of our paper, is now on a very, very different track, and it says that we need to really change some of our own consumption of wood and paper. We're also seeing a pattern in the southern oceans losing their ability to store carbon dioxide. As you know, the ecosystem services of the ocean and forest and soils have been taking up about half of the total carbon dioxide emitted. So they've been doing us a very important service for many years. And the oceans particularly have been a dominant force in sequestering that carbon dioxide. But what we're now seeing, at least in the Southern Ocean, is a decline in their ability to do that work for us. And so as they lose their capacity to do that work, we're seeing other changes as well. This was mentioned earlier, but we now see a trend that's very, very troubling in terms of emissions. We are outside of the worst case scenario of the IPCC. So despite the 10 years of Kyoto, because US and India and also particularly China have been sitting outside of the obligations, we're seeing the growth that's far exceeding what the IPCC has suggested would be the worst case scenario. I would like to have you think about this because it threads back to what Herm Daly was talking about earlier. When the pot boils over at home, and we've all experienced this, right? Who in their right mind would suggest that we turn up the temperature? And yet that's exactly what every policy that's currently being proposed will do. One of my friends who's at the Heinz Center has done a calculation, and he's determined, using this new model that's been developed by the MIT folks that emulates the IPCC models but runs on a desktop. It's an emulation model. But Dr. Bob Carell has run these numbers, and he basically says we need to cut our emissions by about 5% per year for the next